A single candle flickers in the gloom. Its flame shudders, as if it senses what's coming. Shadows crawl across parchment, silver glints off a dagger, and in the hush, a chilling laugh slices through the silence. This isn't a tale of witches in hovels or peasants in fear. Tonight, it's a noblewoman who stands accused of sorcery, murder, and making pacts with the devil himself, right in the heart of medieval Kilkenny. Kilkenny, the year of our Lord, 1324. The Bishop of Ossory, Richard de Draped, dips his quill in ink, thick as old blood, and signs an arrest warrant for a most unusual suspect. Not a peasant woman muttering charms in the hedgerow, not a midwife blamed for a stillborn child, but Lady Alice Kyteler, the wealthy widow of not one, but 4 husbands. She is a Hiberno-Norman noblewoman whose estates stretch farther than most men's ambitions. She commands her servants like soldiers, her lovers like courtiers, and her stepchildren like inconveniences to be managed. To accuse her is to accuse influence, money, and power wrapped in fine French silks. Yet the charge is read like a medieval fever dream. Murder achieved not with knife or poison alone, but through sorcery. Blood drained from her own servants, mixed with exotic powders to anoint idols. Sexual congress, yes, recorded in ecclesiastical Latin with a demon named Robin Artisan, who appeared sometimes as a tall, dark-skinned man, and sometimes as a shaggy dog. The court records offer no explanation for this. Versatility. Witnesses whisper of midnight rites behind the carved oak doors of her chambers, the burning of unfamiliar herbs, incantations in a mix of French, Latin, and something older, banquets where guests wore masks, dined by candlelight, and disappeared into adjoining rooms for rites that scribes would later describe in phrases so vague you can almost hear the blush in their ink. This was not happening in some remote windswept hut. These were scenes allegedly staged in a grand townhouse on Kilkenny's High Street, in full view of a world where everyone knew everyone's business, and gossip travelled faster than carts on the Dublin road. What makes the case so absurd is not merely the scandalous content of the accusations, but the collision of 3 worlds: feudal land disputes, continental witch-hunting ideology, and bedroom gossip too salacious for even the most jaded court clerks. Lady Alice's trial would become the first recorded witchcraft prosecution in Ireland, and the only one in which the accused arrived at court under a canopy of wealth and noble status rather than the shadow of poverty. It was a spectacle, part heresy inquest, part political manoeuvre, part salacious theatre. And at the heart of it all was a woman whose name would survive centuries, not because she was proven guilty, but because she vanished without a trace, leaving behind a servant to burn in her place, and a paper trail that reads like the script of a medieval scandal play. This is the story of the devil in Kilkenny, the noblewoman who, according to her enemies, tortured for pleasure, supped with demons, and laughed as the law tried to catch her. The air inside Lady Alice Kyteler's townhouse was never still. Heavy curtains kept out the draught from Kilkenny's High Street, muting the sound of cartwheels and market cries. Inside, footsteps echoed across tiled floors polished to a dull gleam, while the faint scent of imported spices lingered in the air, a reminder that this was a house of wealth, not want. Servants moved quickly, but never without the wariness of people who had learned that the wrong glance could invite trouble. Alice herself was a figure apart. Draped in gowns of French silk and Flemish brocade, she seemed to glide rather than walk. Her voice was measured, low, and according to later testimony capable of warmth or cutting frost, depending on her mood. Few questioned her in public, fewer still dared to contradict her in private. In an age when noblewomen might manage estates but were still expected to defer to male authority, Alice appeared to operate under her own rules. Those rules, as the stories went, could be severe. Witnesses in the bishop's later inquiry spoke of punishments delivered not for disobedience, but for amusement. Servants claimed she would order them to stand for hours in the cold courtyard, while she and her guests dined in comfort, the music of foreign minstrels carrying into the night. Sometimes, the music stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of her voice, sharp, commanding, and then resumed as though nothing had happened. One allegation described marks cut into a servant's skin not deep enough to cripple, but enough to leave a lasting sign. The shape was never clearly described in the records, only that it was unseemly and against God's order. Another account spoke of humiliations staged during feast days, when a servant might be made to kneel at the head of the hall while the assembled guests drank to their discomfort. In the formal language of the court depositions, these were acts of chastisement. In the servant's own words, they were for her sport. The feasts themselves were a spectacle. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, imported cheeses, and flagons of Gascon wine. The flicker of candlelight glinted off polished silverware, while embroidered banners draped from the rafters. Guests of rank would recline in carved chairs, while musicians from Brittany or Flanders played tunes unfamiliar to local ears. Occasionally, the songs shifted into strange tongues, neither French nor Latin, which some swore were charms or invocations. In the medieval imagination, cruelty and refinement were not mutually exclusive. A noble could be praised for generosity to peers while feared by their household. Alice's reputation grew in precisely this way, lavish to allies, ruthless to dependents. Kilkenny's merchants, whose fortunes depended on her patronage, could overlook whispers about her temper. Servants, lacking such freedom, carried those whispers into the alleys and taverns. 4 marriages had brought Alice not only wealth, but also political insulation. Her first 2 husbands were Norman merchants of considerable means. The third, a man of local influence. The fourth, a landholder whose estate further expanded her control. Each death was recorded without public scandal at the time, though later witnesses would insist that her hand had guided them. No poison vials were ever found, no obvious signs of foul play, yet suspicion gathered like dust in corners no broom could reach. It is telling that no formal accusations arose until after her last husband's health declined. Rumours hardened into stories, stories into testimonies. Servants who had endured her punishments now found an eager audience in the bishop's officials. Some swore they had seen her mix powders at night. Others claimed she held conversations with unseen figures in the shadows. The more improbable the claim, the more it seemed to fit the shape of the growing legend. One particularly enduring detail was her fondness for foreign entertainers. Minstrels who sang in languages few understood, acrobats who performed by torchlight, these lent her gatherings an air of exoticism that was both admired and mistrusted. In a town where most music was sacred or seasonal, the arrival of a Provençal ballad in midwinter could be unsettling. It suggested influences from beyond the island, and in the rhetoric of the bishop's court, foreign was a word that could be made to mean dangerous. Her townhouse on High Street became the centre of this dual reputation. To her peers, it was a place of fine company and exceptional hospitality. To her detractors, it was a stage for calculated displays of dominance. The high windows revealed nothing of the interior, but the constant comings and goings of messengers, servants, and visiting merchants provided plenty of material for speculation. Alice's own demeanour during this period is recorded only in fragments. One clerk noted that she spoke with calm insolence when pressed on her household's affairs. Another described her as serene in the presence of accusation. If she knew the rumours gathering around her, she gave no sign of concern. Her confidence, whether genuine or feigned, only deepened the impression that she was untouchable. It was this combination of opulence, authority, and the undercurrent of fear that made her so compelling a target when the time came. The Bishop of Ossory did not need to persuade the town that something was amiss, only to frame it in terms the ecclesiastical court could act upon. And in the record he began to build, Lady Alice Kyteler was not merely a difficult noblewoman. She was, as his documents would suggest, a predator cloaked in wealth, hiding her cruelties behind candlelight and song. Her life, so carefully arranged to command respect and obedience, would soon be rearranged into a narrative of sorcery and sadism. The stage was already set. All that remained was for the bishop to open the curtain. The townhouse on Kilkenny's High Street was large enough to swallow sound. From the street, its carved doorway and narrow windows gave little hint of what happened inside. The rooms beyond were dim in the afternoons, lit only by the thin light filtering through shutters and the glow of rushlights. Servants moved through these spaces as if rehearsing a silent play, each aware of their role and of the watchful eyes that might be upon them. It was here, according to later depositions, that Alice Kyteler's familia began to take on a shape both domestic and strange. To outward appearances, they were household retainers, cooks, grooms, maids, and a steward or two. But the bishop's records would cast them as something more deliberate, a circle bound not only by service, but by oaths. Allegations claimed that Alice drew them into secret rites, holding their loyalty not merely through wages, but through fear, shared ritual, and promises that strayed beyond earthly reward. The language of the accusations was careful, never quite clear whether these bonds were voluntary or coerced. The servant's own testimony, collected under conditions unlikely to encourage candour, painted scenes of midnight gatherings in her private chambers. Candles burned low in wrought iron holders, casting shadows that clung to the tapestries. The air was heavy with the scent of herbs, rosemary, sage, and others the witnesses could not name. Bowls of powder were mixed with liquids until they formed pastes, the purposes of which were left to imagination. The witnesses claimed the words spoken were neither wholly French nor Latin, but something older, carrying a cadence that lingered in the ear long after the sounds themselves had faded. Alongside the servants were other, less easily defined members of her circle, occasional lovers, companions of uncertain station, and, according to the bishop's report, one or more of her stepchildren. Whether these younger relatives joined willingly or under some form of compulsion was never resolved, though their later participation in her prosecution suggests loyalties were not unshakable. In the ecclesiastical telling, this mixture of family, servants, and intimates formed a kind of household coven, a unit structured like a noble retinue, yet operating according to rules not sanctioned by the church. Most curious of all was the figure known as Robin Artisan. Descriptions in the court records wavered between two forms. At times a tall man of dark complexion, dressed in foreign style. At others, a great shaggy dog with eyes that caught the firelight too well. No effort was made by the scribes to reconcile these accounts, and none seems to have been considered necessary. To the medieval mind, a being that could shift shape was not improbable, it was proof of the presence of the demonic. Some witnesses placed Robin at the centre of the rituals, receiving offerings of bread and milk, or strange powders pressed into the shape of small cakes. Others claimed he merely stood in the shadows, a silent presence that caused the air to feel colder. The suggestion that Alice's authority over her household was reinforced by such a figure was not merely theatrical, it was calculated to transform a difficult noblewoman into an agent of infernal influence. The bishop's clerks described the oaths sworn within this inner circle as blasphemous and contrary to God's law. Details were sparse, but enough was recorded to suggest that these oaths bound members to secrecy regarding the rites, the powders, and the figure of Robin. The line between genuine belief and political convenience was thin. Some servants may have spoken of such oaths because the officials expected to hear of them, and others because it gave structure to grievances they had long held in silence. In daylit hours, the coven looked like any noble household. The cooks prepared meals for a dozen mouths, the steward handled accounts, and the grooms saw to the horses. It was only in the retelling, especially under questioning, that ordinary duties were recast as acts of conspiracy. A kitchen mixing spices for the evening meal became an alchemical laboratory. A servant running an errand after sunset became a messenger on occult business. There is an odd irony in the fact that many of the items later seized from Alice's chambers, herbs, ointments, carved images, could also be found in the homes of respectable women of means. What made them sinister in her case was not their nature, but their context. Wealth, foreign connections, and a readiness to defy the bishop's summons. The same rosemary that flavoured a merchant's stew was, in her possession, a tool of witchcraft. Her familia, once a mark of her influence and reach, became the scaffold upon which the bishop's case was built. Each member could be cast as a witness or a conspirator, and sometimes as both. In a medieval court, the distinction was flexible enough to serve whatever narrative the prosecution required. And so, in the parchment record, Lady Alice's household transformed. No longer a retinue bound by contracts and coin, it became, at least on paper, a coven in service to its mistress, sworn to secrecy, and watched over by a demon who might enter the hall as a man or pad silently through it as a dog. The High Street townhouse, which had once been only a seat of noble living, was recast as a fortress of whispered heresies, its doors closing each night on rituals no outsider could see. From here, the accusations would only grow more elaborate, moving beyond the structure of the coven into the alleged rites themselves, rituals where pain and pleasure blurred, and where the line between noble feast and forbidden ceremony was thin enough to vanish in the candlelight. The chambers where Lady Alice Kyteler allegedly held her rites were not dungeons. They were rooms appointed with the trappings of wealth tapestries thick enough to keep out the winter wind, carved oak furniture polished to a mirror sheen, cushions stuffed with goose down. Yet, in the language of the depositions, these same spaces became stages for ceremonies that unsettled even seasoned ecclesiastical scribes. The witnesses, mostly servants and one or two reluctant guests, described scenes where comfort and cruelty shared the same table. The accounts begin with blood, not in torrents, but in small, deliberate measures taken from the arms of household servants. The testimonies say the blood was caught in silver bowls, then stirred with powders ground in pestles of brass or stone. These powders, said to smell sharp and bitter, were later used to anoint small wooden figures or metal talismans. The idols themselves were never found, though the bishop's men claimed to have heard descriptions. Human in outline, but with faces that could not be matched to anyone known. One witness spoke of a night when the household gathered at Alice's command, each participant masked. The masks were of leather, linen, or painted wood foxes, birds, and strange smiling faces. They dined by candlelight, the flames throwing long shadows up the walls until the room seemed taller than it was. Music played, slow and foreign, until at some unseen signal the musicians stopped and the masks turned toward the head of the table. What followed was described only as whispered rites. The clerk recording the statement left no further elaboration, perhaps unwilling or unable to translate what was said. Others described the burning of herbs in bronze censers, the smoke curling through the room in thick aromatic clouds. Participants moved through the haze, touching the idols with their fingertips, sometimes pressing their foreheads to them. In one account, Alice herself traced patterns on a servant's skin with the smoke-darkened tip of a feather. The meaning of these gestures was never explained, though the prosecution was content to call them blasphemous. Pain, according to the witnesses, was as carefully measured as the blood. It was never wanton in the telling it was ritualized. A servant might be pinched, pricked, or made to hold an uncomfortable posture until shaking with strain, while others looked on. These acts were not presented as punishment, but as offerings, a giving of the body for purposes unnamed. The bishop's men, ever alert for heresy, interpreted them as pledges to the devil himself. Pleasure, too, was threaded into the accounts, though with a delicacy that suggests the scribes were writing with one eye on propriety. They noted only that certain rites descended into carnal disorder, or that after the rituals, each took their ease according to inclination. The absence of detail is almost more telling than inclusion. The omissions leave space for the imagination to supply whatever the listener finds most troubling. The mingling of pain and pleasure was not, in itself, alien to medieval thought. Flagellants, penitents, and mystics all engaged in acts that blurred the line. What made Alice's case unusual was the setting and the company, not the cloister, but a noble's hall. Not nuns or monks, but servants, lovers, and occasional outsiders. Here was the imagery of piety turned inside out, its symbols reordered for a purpose that the court insisted must be infernal. One strange note in the testimonies concerns the food served at these gatherings. Alongside the usual meats and breads were dishes coloured green, blue, or black hues unnatural for the fare of the time. Whether this was a trick of the candlelight, the result of unusual spices, or an invention of frightened witnesses is unclear. The bishop's records, however, preserved it as further evidence of the household's deviation from the natural order. Robin Artisan, the familiar, is said to have been present at some of these rites, whether as man or hound. In the latter form, he was described as lying beneath the table, silent except for an occasional low sound that might have been a growl or, as one servant put it, a laugh that was not human. The possibility that the sound was simply a dog clearing its throat was not entertained by the court. In all these descriptions runs a thread of the theatrical: the masks, the music, the smoke, the measured acts of pain and indulgence. These are elements as much of performance as of devotion. It is impossible now to say how much was genuine belief, how much was social bonding, and how much was the embroidery of witnesses under pressure. But in the eyes of the bishop's court, it was enough to mark Alice's household as a site of formalized wickedness. And so the image took root, not of a crone muttering over a hearth, but of a noblewoman presiding over candlelit feasts that dissolved into whispered blasphemies, her servants, both audience and participants. The absurdity, noted even by later chroniclers, was that all of this, if it happened at all, unfolded not in a remote forest or windswept ruin, but within earshot of Kilkenny's market traders and church bells. From here, the narrative would leave the private chambers and enter the broader arena, where bishops and nobles would argue not only about her rights, but about why the charge of witchcraft had taken root in Ireland at all. The winter of 1324 brought a chill sharper than frost to Kilkenny, though not all of it came from the weather. In the episcopal residence, where stone walls turned drafts into whispers, the newly appointed Bishop of Ossory, Richard de Draped, was still arranging his books when the first rumours of Lady Alice Kyteler reached him. He was not, by temperament or training, a man to let rumours lie. Educated in England and steeped in the doctrines of the Franciscan order, he carried with him a zeal for reform that left little room for leniency. The bishop believed in heresy the way a fisherman believes in the tide inevitable, dangerous, and requiring constant vigilance. Richard de Draped had arrived in Ireland with a mission that was at once pastoral and punitive. The pastoral was for the faithful, who might be guided toward correct belief. The punitive was for those who strayed. In his mind, Ireland was fertile ground for both. Continental Europe was already aflame with prosecutions for sorcery and heresy. Why should Ireland be spared? A bishop who allowed his diocese to remain quiet risked being seen as inattentive, or worse, complicit. From his chambers, he could look down upon the narrow streets of Kilkenny, where merchants haggled over barrels of wine, and farmers drove carts heavy with winter grain. To him, this was not merely a market town, but a potential stage for a lesson in orthodoxy. The law, both canon and secular, was a patchwork here, allowing an ambitious prelate considerable freedom in framing charges. And Lady Alice, with her wealth, her Norman lineage, and her apparent disdain for ecclesiastical summons, was a target that could be pursued without fear of petty retaliation. The first summons he issued to her was ignored. The second was returned with the polite defiance of a noblewoman confident in her standing. For de Draped, this was not merely insolence, it was an opening. Failure to appear could itself be construed as contempt of court, a step on the ladder toward formal censure. It also added a note of personal challenge, which he did not easily forget. There was also the matter of example. On the continent, bishops gained reputations by rooting out spectacular cases. A heresy trial was a performance as much as a legal proceeding. The more elaborate the charges, the greater the demonstration of the Church's vigilance. By drawing upon imported notions of witchcraft, demons in bodily form, nocturnal assemblies, pacts sealed with flesh, Deledrade could present Kilkenny as a diocese not backward, but fully engaged in the spiritual battles of Christendom. His approach was methodical. He gathered sworn statements from household servants, each one carefully recorded in the formal Latin of ecclesiastical courts. Under questioning, details became sharper, stranger, and far more useful for the construction of a case. What could not be verified could at least be repeated, and repetition, especially in an official register, had a way of becoming fact. Deledrade's political position was both strong and precarious. Strong, because as bishop, he wielded both spiritual authority and considerable influence over secular magistrates. Precarious, because Ireland's nobility, especially those of Norman descent, were protective of their privileges and resentful of ecclesiastical interference. To accuse one of their own was to walk a narrow bridge. Fall to one side, and you were a champion of orthodoxy; fall to the other, and you were an interloper meddling in affairs beyond your remit. His correspondence from the period, where it survives, shows a man conscious of this balancing act. He wrote to higher ecclesiastical authorities, framing the case as a matter of urgent necessity. While within Kilkenny, he allowed the rumours to ferment without overtly taking credit for them. It was a blend of public reserve and private orchestration, the kind of political choreography that often passes for impartial justice in records of the time. There is no indication that Deledrade doubted the charges. Belief and ambition worked in tandem here. To root out witchcraft was a holy duty, and to prosecute a case of such magnitude would cement his reputation. The dual reward, salvation for souls and prestige for the bishopric, was too aligned to ignore. Whether or not Alice's household rites were as described, they served his purpose perfectly. In the bishop's hands, the accusations began to take on the structure of a continental heresy case. This was no local quarrel over inheritance or insult. It was a matter of cosmic allegiance. A noblewoman consorting with a demon was not merely a scandal. It was a warning that even the highest ranks were vulnerable to corruption. By pursuing her, Deledrade could demonstrate that neither wealth nor lineage could shield one from the Church's reach. And yet, there is an irony in the way the charges advanced. The very grandeur of Alice's position, the silks, the townhouse, the feasts, made the story more compelling to those who would never enter her hall. The bishop could cast her as a symbol of the world's temptations, gilded on the outside but tainted within. For a preacher intent on moral instruction, it was as if the case had been designed in advance. By the time formal proceedings were underway, the political lines were drawn. Supporters of the bishop spoke of moral decay seeping through the upper classes. Defenders of Alice hinted at overreach, ambition, and foreign notions being imposed on Irish soil. In the middle stood the townspeople, watching the affair unfold like a mystery play, whose ending promised both revelation and ruin. For Deledrade, the stage was set. The next act would be played not in the hushed rooms of Alice's townhouse, but in the open arena of ecclesiastical trial, where the politics of the bishop would meet the politics of the accused, and the verdict would depend as much on power as on proof. By the early 14th century, the idea of the witch was no longer confined to the village healer or the solitary crone of local superstition. On the continent, particularly in France and Flanders, a more elaborate figure had emerged, one woven from theological treatises, courtly gossip, and the imaginative embroidery of inquisitors. This witch was not simply a user of charms, she was a conspirator in a vast, invisible rebellion against God. Her crimes included feasts with demons, aerial flights to secret gatherings, and the brewing of poisons from unholy ingredients. It was this image, not the modest herb wife of Irish tradition, that travelled across the Channel with men like Bishop Deledrade. The continental model came with its own vocabulary. Terms like sabbatum and maleficium appeared in records. lending a scholarly gravity to what might otherwise have been dismissed as tavern talk. Demons were no longer vague forces but named, categorized, and described with unsettling precision. They entered court records like unwelcome guests at a banquet, each with a specific form, appetite, and method of corrupting the human soul. The effect was to turn accusations of witchcraft into theological indictments, backed by the full machinery of canon law. In France, trials had already established the pattern: a gathering at night, away from prying eyes, a feast in which blessings were inverted, and the exchange of vows between witch and familiar. Flemish accounts added their own flourish, imagining not only sexual congress with demons, but contracts signed in blood, spells to wither crops, and powders to unman rivals. These details, recorded by clerks in the language of the courts, took on an air of legal fact, transplanting easily into any jurisdiction with a willing prosecutor. When such ideas reached Ireland, they met a landscape both fertile and resistant. The Irish had their own traditions of cailleach and bean feaser, figures who could curse or cure, sometimes for payment, often for kinship duty. Their magic was personal, local, and seldom tied to formal heresy. To accuse a noblewoman of demonic congress would have seemed strange had not the bishop's imported framework provided a ready-made script. What the local imagination might not have supplied, the continental model could import wholesale. In this imported cosmology, Lady Alice's alleged rites found an instant translation. The masked feasts became Sabbaths. The burning of herbs became the fumigation of idols. The familiar Robin artisan became a demon in legal fact, regardless of whether he appeared as man or hound. Each element of the servant's testimony slotted neatly into categories already established in continental law books. It was as though the bishop had been waiting for a case that would fit the mold. The irony was that many of these elements were implausible to the point of theatricality. One witness described Robin speaking fluent French, though no one could agree on his accent. Another insisted the powders used in the household could make a man forget his own name, a claim that even the scribe recording it seemed reluctant to endorse without a raised eyebrow. Yet the absurdity of the details did not weaken the case. In the logic of witchcraft trials, the fantastic often counted as proof of the supernatural. Continental ideology also brought with it a blurring of moral and physical crimes. A death in the household could be prosecuted as both murder and heresy, doubling the gravity of the charge. Poisoning was no longer just an act against the body, but a sacrilege against the divine order. This fusion of categories allowed a bishop to claim jurisdiction where secular courts might otherwise hold sway, a useful advantage in a land where authority was contested. In such a framework, the accused need not be caught in the act. Confession, testimony, or even the common fame of misdeeds could serve as the foundation for conviction. This looseness of standard was not a flaw in the system. It was its design. A crime that could be proven by fear alone was a crime that could always be prosecuted. For a bishop seeking to assert his authority, it was an ideal instrument. Yet, the continental image of the witch was not adopted wholesale. Irish records show a certain reluctance to embrace the more spectacular claims of night flights or assemblies on mountaintops. What persisted were the elements that could be most easily adapted to local politics: the demonic familiar, the ritual feast, the use of poison in inheritance disputes. These were the pieces that made sense in a land where land itself was often the greatest prize. The testimonies against Lady Alice, when read alongside French and Flemish trial records, reveal a striking symmetry. The same types of rites, the same inversion of Christian symbols, the same claim of sensual pacts with the infernal. Whether by design or coincidence, her case became a bridge between two worlds, the old Irish patterns of magic and the imported European obsession with organized devilry. It was a bridge the bishop was eager to cross. Thus the stage was set not only for a prosecution, but for a precedent. From here on, accusations in Ireland could draw upon the prestige of continental theology, dressing local grievances in the robes of cosmic warfare. And for Lady Alice, it meant that what might once have been dismissed as eccentric cruelty was now read as proof of a pact with hell itself. The next part of the story would reveal that the imported ideology was not the only foreign influence at work. Family quarrels, property claims, and long-nursed resentments would soon join hands with the bishop's theology, giving the prosecution both motive and means. If the imported theories of witchcraft gave the bishop a framework, the machinery that drove the case forward was far more familiar to medieval Ireland. Family quarrels. In Kilkenny, where noble households were stitched together by successive marriages, stepchildren often shared roofs without ever sharing affections. Lady Alice had been married 4 times, and from those unions came a tangle of heirs, step-heirs, and those who considered themselves disinherited. It was in these blurred lines of kinship that the first accusations took root. Her surviving stepchildren, particularly from her earlier marriages, had long resented the way estates shifted under her stewardship. Norman law allowed a widow considerable control over her dower lands, and Alice, by all accounts, managed them with a firmness that was neither meek nor temporary. Fields, rents, and even livestock could pass into her hands, leaving the younger generation with less than they believed their due. In a culture where land was as much identity as wealth, this was not a slight easily forgiven. The deaths of her husbands, each under circumstances ambiguous enough to invite speculation, became, in hindsight, convenient tragedies. In the narrative woven by her accusers, these were not the turns of fortune common to the era, but deliberate acts of sorcery and poison. It was a story with a practical aim. If her property could be tied to criminal acts, her claim to it could be undone. Inheritance disputes might not stir the wider public, but witchcraft charges could move mountains, or at least transfer acres. The bishop's court was an eager listener. Testimonies from these discontented heirs dovetailed neatly with the continental model of maleficium, but were rooted in grievances that required no theological gloss. They spoke of powders mixed into drink, of whispered words over beds at night, of sudden illnesses that robbed their fathers of strength. Each recollection, however shaded by time, became a plank in the prosecution's platform. Not all accusations were direct. Some stepchildren framed their claims in the language of concern, as though warning the court of dangers for the common good. Others were more blunt, describing Alice as a destroyer of households whose ambition knew no blood ties. Whether these were heartfelt convictions or calculated performances, the effect was the same. The bishop's case acquired a motive that could be grasped even by those unmoved by theology. There is a certain irony in the arrangement. The same stepchildren who denounced her for unholy rites stood to inherit more if she were convicted. Their pursuit of justice, however piously phrased, ran parallel to their pursuit of property. In medieval courts, such conflicts of interest were not disqualifying. They were often the very reason a case reached trial. This blending of personal vendetta and public prosecution was not unusual. Throughout Europe, witchcraft charges frequently attached themselves to existing disputes over grazing rights, debts, or marriage contracts. In Kilkenny, it simply happened to involve a woman whose position magnified every grievance. Her wealth ensured the stakes were high. Her defiance ensured the contest would be public. The records show that some witnesses came forward only after the inheritance issue had been discussed in private chambers. Others were household servants, who shifted their accounts once they learned which narrative the court favoured. In such an environment, truth was not discarded so much as trimmed, adjusted, and made to fit the frame already being assembled. Lady Alice's own responses, where recorded, were curt and dismissive. She treated certain allegations as beneath reply, focusing instead on the legal improprieties of the bishop's proceedings. This did little to endear her to relatives who already saw her as arrogant. To them, each word was confirmation that she considered herself untouchable, a perception they were determined to test. By the time the charges reached their full form, the case was a hybrid, half theological indictment, half property dispute. In the court's eyes, this was not a contradiction but a reinforcement. A soul corrupted by greed could easily be corrupted by the devil, and vice versa. The bishop's cause and the stepchildren's cause had merged into a single pursuit, each side supplying what the other lacked. And so, the domestic disputes of a noble household became the public business of a diocese. The accusations now rested on three pillars: the bishop's imported vision of organized devilry, the servants' theatrical testimonies, and the heir's deeply practical grievances. Together, they formed a case that would pull Kilkenny into the rare position of hosting Ireland's first full-scale witchcraft trial. The next part of the story turns back the clock to see what kind of world could produce such a trial in the first place, when noblewomen could command armies, yet still find themselves accused of dining with demons. In the early 14th century, the figure of the aristocratic widow occupied a peculiar place in Irish society. She could, in theory, move more freely than many men, free from the daily obligations of military service, yet holding the keys to lands, rents, and households. The law, both Norman and Gaelic, allowed such women to administer their dower property, act as guardians for heirs, and, when necessary, hire armed retainers to defend those holdings. They were not ornamental. They were, in a sense, the hinge between dynastic stability and dissolution. Their authority was accepted, but only so long as it remained within invisible boundaries set by family and church. In Norman-settled towns like Kilkenny, noblewomen often presided over estates in their husband's absence, whether he was in Dublin attending the Lord's Council or across the sea on campaign. They collected rents in coin and kind, adjudicated disputes among tenants, and signed their names to contracts bearing the wax seals of their lineage. A widow with sufficient skill could keep her estates productive and profitable, ensuring her household remained a centre of influence. Such women were courted not only for marriage, but for alliance. To wed them was to acquire the networks they commanded. A widow who chose not to remarry, however, could complicate these designs. Church doctrine nominally praised chastity in widows, but in practice preferred that their wealth be folded back into male-led households. An independent noblewoman was, for some clerics, a contradiction in terms, a vessel without a captain, and therefore a potential danger to both moral and social order. Yet the very legal frameworks of the Anglo-Norman world created these contradictions, granting widows substantial autonomy in the absence of a husband. Some used that autonomy quietly. Others, like Alice Kyteler, were more conspicuous in their authority. Conspicuousness, in this period, was a liability. Gaelic Ireland offered its own parallel. Here, elite women could inherit under certain circumstances, especially if no close male relative stood in line. They managed cattle herds, a form of wealth as politically potent as castles, and participated in fostering arrangements that tied clans together. The Gaelic legal tradition allowed for a degree of female agency that surprised some Anglo-Norman observers, but this agency was still bound by clan consensus. A woman acting entirely in her own right, rather than as part of a kinship strategy, was a rare sight and a subject of comment. For both Norman and Gaelic elites, public perception was as critical as legal entitlement. A widow's ability to retain authority often depended on her perceived dignity, piety, and moderation. Too much display of wealth, or too firm a hand in politics, could invite murmurs that she was grasping or unnatural. These murmurs were not idle. They could harden into accusations that blurred the line between moral failing and criminal offence. The political climate of early 14th century Ireland magnified these risks. Tensions between the Anglo-Norman lords and the native Irish were constant, punctuated by feuds within the settler community itself. Ecclesiastical authority, strengthened by papal interest in curbing local excesses, often served as arbiter in disputes that were as much about land as about sin. A noblewoman who fell out of favour could find her every action interpreted through the most suspicious lens available. If she also had enemies within her own household, the combination could be fatal to her reputation. Wealth itself could be a form of provocation. Land brought rents, rents brought retainers, retainers implied military capacity. A widow with her own troop of armed men, even a modest one, could unsettle neighbouring lords who preferred such resources to be under male command. The line between respected authority and perceived overreach was perilously thin. Cross it, and the social order had a ready supply of narratives to explain why such power must be curbed. There was, too, an older tradition of viewing powerful women through a supernatural frame. In Gaelic lore, sovereignty goddesses bestowed kingship, often through a ritual union. The echoes of such myths sometimes clung to living women who seemed to wield unusual influence. To an Anglo-Norman bishop, however, such echoes were not quaint but troubling, a reminder that pagan associations still lingered in the cultural imagination. A widow commanding loyalty might be read, in one idiom, as a capable matriarch, in another, as a woman in league with darker forces. Context was everything, and context was malleable. Marriage alliances provided another arena where noble women exercised and exposed their influence. Choosing a husband, or refusing one, was an act with political consequences. A strategic remarriage could realign power across counties. A stubborn refusal could leave suitors and their families embittered. The bishop's court did not prosecute such refusals, but the resentment they generated often resurfaced in less direct forms. Charges of moral impropriety, whispered or formal, were one such form. The clerical ideal of female virtue was not impossible to meet, but it was nearly impossible to meet, while also preserving independent authority. Piety and power were expected to exist in inverse proportion. A wealthy widow who dressed plainly, endowed chapels, and spoke softly might remain unchallenged for years. One who dressed in imported silks, employed foreign musicians, and spoke her mind could find herself at the centre of unwelcome attention. By the 1322nd, Alice Kyteler had long since chosen her presentation. In this, she was neither wholly unique nor entirely without precedent. Other noblewomen had held estates in their own name and pursued suits in court against male rivals. Some had prevailed, others had been pressured into cloister or remarriage. What distinguished Alice was not that she held power, but that she held it in a way, and at a time, that collided with multiple vested interests. When the accusations finally came, they drew on pre-existing narratives about the dangers of women who ruled their own households. Thus, the trial that would follow did not arise in a vacuum. It took root in a society that allowed women like Alice to hold the reins, but never stopped questioning whether they should. Her case would become a test of those boundaries, and of how easily they could be redrawn when political and personal motives aligned. The next scene in Kilkenny's unfolding drama shifts from the woman to the stage itself, the merchant town whose wealth, gossip, and imported ideas made it the perfect setting for Ireland's first witch trial. Kilkenny in the 1322nd was a town of stone and timber, its streets winding beneath the shadow of a Norman castle that had long since settled into the landscape like a permanent overseer. Merchants from England, Wales, and Flanders kept shops along the high street, their signs painted with ships, wine casks, and sheaves of grain. The air carried the scent of brewing ale and tanned leather, mingled with the sharper tang of lime from ongoing construction. It was a place where money and gossip moved with equal speed, and often in the same direction. The River Nore divided the settlement into quarters, bridged by a span that had seen as many markets as it had military crossings. Barges brought in wine from Gascony, cloth from Bruges, and salt from the Bay of Biscay. These goods did not simply pass through, they lingered, adorning the tables and wardrobes of the town's wealthier residents. Foreign fabrics draped windows against the winter wind. Imported spices transformed the simplest dishes into signs of status. Every arrival was noted, every change in fashion remarked upon. Kilkenny's position as a Norman stronghold made it both prosperous and politically sensitive. The town's charter granted privileges to its burgesses, who guarded them carefully against encroachment from the surrounding Gaelic lordships. Within the walls, English common law predominated, Beyond them, Brehon law still held sway. The meeting of these two systems created a constant negotiation, one carried out in market stalls, in taverns, and, when necessary, in the bishop's court. It was a place where jurisdiction itself could be a bargaining chip. The cathedral, with its tower visible from most streets, served as a daily reminder of ecclesiastical authority. Its chapter was closely tied to the Franciscan friary and to the bishop's residence, ensuring that moral oversight was never far from civic life. Clerics kept an attentive ear to the town's rhythms, hearing confessions that occasionally doubled as intelligence reports. A merchant's dispute over unpaid debts could be reframed, with sufficient embellishment, as a matter of sin requiring formal censure. The boundaries between civil and spiritual matters were thin and easily crossed. Kilkenny's social life centred on a handful of households whose wealth and hospitality made them magnets for travellers and favour seekers. Feasts in these homes were occasions of theatre, not just for the food, but for the alliances hinted at in who sat where. Music, often from foreign minstrels, added an exotic edge to evenings otherwise devoted to local politics. Here, news from the continent blended with rumour from the next parish, producing a narrative of the world that was equal parts fact and embroidery. Reputations could be made or unmade before the final course was served. Witchcraft, in the Irish tradition, was a familiar but small-scale affair. Curses, blessings, and herbal remedies existed alongside Christian rites without causing much alarm. A cunning woman might be consulted in confidence to heal a cow or recover stolen goods. The act was rarely cause for public scandal. The idea of organised Sabbaths, pacts with demons or nocturnal flights was foreign, imported from France, Flanders, and England, with the same ships that carried wine and silk. In Kilkenny, these ideas found an audience eager for novelty, if not for accuracy. By the time Bishop Richard de Draped arrived, the town was already accustomed to continental fashions in both clothing and conversation. His sermons, peppered with examples of diabolical plots from abroad, fell on ears attuned to the exotic and the alarming. Tales of women flying to distant gatherings or consorting with shape-shifting demons were received less as theological warnings than as gripping entertainment. Yet entertainment had a way of becoming evidence when repeated often enough in the right circles. The bishop understood this, and Kilkenny's rumour mill provided the ideal machinery. Markets were as much about information as about goods. A seller of apples might also offer the latest on who had quarrelled with whom, and whether certain ailments were the work of natural causes or less wholesome influences. Such exchanges were not idle chatter. They shaped public perception long before formal accusations were made. In a town where everyone knew the price of a loaf, they also knew the cost of a reputation lost. A whisper could be carried downriver faster than any cargo. Alice Kyteler's High Street residence placed her in the very centre of this network. Her wealth, foreign connections, and unapologetic presence made her a subject of comment even in quieter seasons. When her household became the focus of official inquiry, it was not a matter of introducing suspicion but of directing it. Kilkenny's citizens already had a repertoire of stories about her. The trial would simply give them a new stage. In the meantime, the ordinary life of the town supplied the perfect backdrop for extraordinary claims. The irony lay in the coexistence of commerce and accusation. The same ships that brought fine fabrics for Alice's gowns also carried the books and sermons that would frame her as a heretic. The same feast tables that displayed her status would later be described as altars for forbidden rites. Kilkenny's appetite for novelty did not distinguish between the imported and the invented. In a marketplace of ideas, the most sensational product often sold the fastest. Thus, by the eve of her prosecution, Kilkenny was primed for a spectacle. The town's merchants and murmurers had already built the scaffolding of a narrative in which a wealthy widow could plausibly be the centre of a demonic conspiracy. All it required was an authority willing to act on those murmurs, and a setting in which the lines between civic order and spiritual purity blurred to nothing. That setting was already in place. The bishop's court was about to take the stage. Before that curtain rises, we must understand the legal world in which such a trial could take root. In early 14th century Ireland, law was not a single, seamless fabric, but a patchwork quilt. Some pieces imported, others woven locally, and many stitched together with visible seams. Within the walls of towns like Kilkenny, English common law applied, carried across the sea by Norman lords, and reinforced by royal charters. Beyond those walls, Brehon law, the native Irish legal tradition, continued to operate in parallel, governing disputes according to a code as old as the sagas. Between the two lay ecclesiastical law, canon law, which claimed jurisdiction over the soul and, when expedient, over the body as well. A case could move between these systems like a coin passed from one hand to another. Theoretically, each system knew its limits. Common law concerned itself with property, contracts, and crimes recognized by the king's courts. Brehon law addressed injury, honor, and restitution, measuring damages in cattle or silver. Canon law dealt with matters of faith, morality, and the governance of the church. In practice, those limits blurred whenever a case carried both political weight and moral charge. A quarrel over inheritance could find itself reframed as a question of heresy. A personal feud could be elevated to the status of a public sin. Witchcraft, as a specific crime, had not yet been fully defined in Irish common law. Acts that would later be prosecuted under statutes against sorcery were instead pursued through existing categories: homicide, poisoning, and heresy. The absence of a clear legal definition was less a barrier than an opportunity. It allowed accusations to be molded into whatever form best suited the forum in which they were heard. In Alice Kyteler's case, the bishop's court chose heresy, a charge that opened the door to ecclesiastical authority and bypassed certain protections available in secular courts. Heresy was a serious business in canon law. It was not merely error, it was willful persistence in error after correction had been offered. The church claimed the right to try heretics because their beliefs endangered the community's salvation. By placing witchcraft within this category, the bishop could argue that Alice's alleged acts, bloodletting, conjuring, and demonic congress, were not just crimes against individuals, but affronts to the faith itself. The framing was strategic, and it placed the burden of defense squarely on the accused. Once a case was classed as heresy, procedures shifted. Evidence could include testimony given under oath by neighbors, servants, or relatives, regardless of whether they had witnessed the acts directly. Suspicion could be reinforced by character assessments, public reputation, or the refusal to take certain oaths. A defendant who declined to appear in person could be declared contumacious, effectively conceding guilt in the eyes of the court. The process was as much about moral theatre as about proof in the modern sense. The bishop's court held certain advantages over the secular bench. It could compel testimony from clerics and laity alike, and it could enlist the power of excommunication to pressure the uncooperative. Its proceedings were not bound by the same evidentiary standards as the king's courts, which demanded more direct forms of proof in cases involving property or life. In ecclesiastical trials, patterns of behavior, whispered reputation, and the agreement of multiple witnesses could carry decisive weight. This flexibility was a useful tool when the accusations were as elaborate as those against Alice. The interplay between law and politics was constant. A bishop might pursue a case in part to assert ecclesiastical jurisdiction over a secular rival. A claimant to property might encourage that pursuit if it promised to unseat an opponent. In such circumstances, the trial itself became a kind of battleground, one fought with writs, proclamations, and depositions rather than swords. Victory was measured not only in verdicts but in who emerged with their authority intact. For all its apparent severity, the legal process still relied on human willingness to participate. Witnesses had to come forward, even if prompted. Clerks had to record testimony. Magistrates had to grant the court its stage. In Kilkenny, all these elements aligned. The bishop's office had both the legal pretext and the political incentive. The town had the appetite for spectacle, and Alice's adversaries had the motive to see it through. The absence of a statutory crime called witchcraft was no hindrance when heresy could serve as its vessel. It is worth noting the irony. In a land with two ancient legal traditions and an imported third, none had originally conceived of prosecuting a noblewoman for dancing with demons. Yet by weaving together bits of each, secular property law, ecclesiastical heresy law, and the malleable language of reputation, a case could be fashioned that satisfied all parties who wished to see her fall. It was, in its way, a triumph of jurisdictional creativity. Whether it was also justice was not a question the courts were inclined to ask. Thus, the trial that followed was less the eruption of a new crime than the repurposing of old tools. The charges could be dressed in exotic terms imported from the continent, but the machinery was local, familiar, and well-oiled. With the legal frame constructed, all that remained was to place Alice within it. When the moment came, the court would present her not only as a criminal in law, but as a danger to the order of the town itself. From there, the story would move into its final act, the pursuit, the flight, and the fate of those left behind. The warrant for Alice Kyteler's arrest was a sheet of parchment no thicker than a man's palm, yet it carried the weight of ecclesiastical authority and royal expectation alike. By the spring of 1324, it had been read aloud in the market square, copied into the bishop's records, and carried to every likely refuge within the lordship of Kilkenny. Its words named her a heretic, a poisoner, and the leader of a coven, accusations designed to leave no space for ambiguity. She was to present herself before the bishop's court without delay. The wording was formal, the command absolute, but parchment can be read, folded, and ignored. And Alice, who had navigated the politics of 4 marriages, 4 estates, and 4 funerals, knew that the summons was only binding if she chose to remain within reach. Kilkenny's High Street, with its arcades and merchant stalls, had seen its share of departures, pilgrims bound for street, Canice's shrine, merchants riding for the Dublin fairs, fugitives slipping away under pretext of trade. Alice's exit left little in the way of official record. No clerk noted the hour. No witness marked the precise gate she passed through. Later testimony would suggest she travelled with a small retinue and ample funds, her route shielded by allies unwilling to see her dragged before an ecclesiastical bench. The absence of detail was itself suspicious in a town where the movements of the powerful were rarely private. In an age when letters could take weeks to arrive, absence could be as decisive a weapon as any forged seal. Her departure was timed with precision. The bishop, Richard de Draped, had himself been detained in Dublin during part of the proceedings, held there on the orders of the justiciar in a dispute over jurisdiction. By the time he returned to press the case in person, Alice was gone. It was a legal sleight of hand without the formality of law, removing the defendant not through acquittal or pardon, but by ensuring she was no longer present to answer. The medieval court had no concept of extradition in the modern sense. A fugitive noblewoman who crossed into another jurisdiction could be pursued only at the pleasure of the authorities there. If those authorities saw more advantage in her freedom than her capture, pursuit would be perfunctory at best. Contemporary rumours placed her first in Dublin, then in England, and finally in Flanders. The last was plausible. Flemish ports were familiar territory to merchants from Kilkenny, and ships left regularly from Waterford laden with wool and hides. A passenger of means could book discreet passage, the captain needing no explanation beyond the payment of silver. From there, the Low Countries offered a scattering of cities where a widow could live comfortably, change her name, and let the Irish climate fade to memory. None of these reports were confirmed, but absence invites speculation. In the bishop's register, her name simply ceased to appear. The court could not try what it could not summon. Instead, its attention shifted to those who had remained. At the centre was Petronilla de Maeve, Alice's servant, and, according to testimony, her accomplice in both sorcery and poisoning. Petronilla had neither the wealth to flee nor the allies to shield her. She was examined, admonished, and, when she persisted in her denials, condemned. On a winter's day in Kilkenny, she was burned at the stake, the first recorded execution for witchcraft in Ireland. The sentence was carried out in public, the smoke intended as both punishment and deterrent. For the bishop, Petronilla's death was a visible success. It provided proof, in his view, that the devil's work had been rooted out and that the ecclesiastical courts held the power to punish it. For Alice's enemies, it removed one of her most loyal defenders. But the absence of the central figure left an emptiness in the record. The charges against Alice remained unresolved, the case formally unfinished. Her property, insofar as it could be claimed, passed through the usual channels of inheritance and legal dispute. Her person, however, was beyond the court's reach. It was an outcome both frustrating and useful. Frustrating to those who wished to see her publicly condemned, useful to those who preferred the scandal to linger as a warning. The story of her flight could be told and retold without the inconvenience of further evidence. She could be painted as a penitent in exile or a witch still at large, depending on the needs of the teller. The absence of a body, in court or in the grave, left space for both morality play and fireside tale. In the years that followed, her name acquired a shadowed afterlife. Some said she had been sighted on a black horse along the quays of Bruges, dressed in fine Flemish cloth. Others that she had entered a convent under an assumed name. The distance between Kilkenny and these imagined scenes only added to their plausibility. Few in Ireland could challenge the account, and fewer still cared to. Her notoriety had been secured, her person could vanish without diminishing it. It is in this vanishing that the case takes on its most absurd quality. The machinery of the trial had been elaborate, proclamations, examinations, depositions, and sermons, yet its outcome hinged on something as prosaic as a door left unguarded. The ecclesiastical court, for all its claims to moral authority, could be undone by the simple fact that one woman knew when to walk away. In that respect, Alice's escape was less an act of sorcery than of logistics, and like much in the record, it could be framed either as providence or as proof of guilt. By the time the bishop closed his register on the affair, the case had achieved a curious balance. One accused had perished, another had disappeared, and the charges remained both notorious and unresolved. The absence of final judgment gave the story a longevity it might not otherwise have had. Kilkenny had seen a trial, a condemnation, and an execution, but never a verdict on its most famous defendant. That gap in the record was wide enough for legend to step through, and legend, once established, is rarely in a hurry to leave. By the time a generation had passed, Alice Kyteler's name had slipped from the formal ledgers of Kilkenny, but remained in the more durable archive of local memory. Her absence, uncorrected by trial or burial, invited the kind of stories that thrive when fact has no further duties to perform. The trial's charges, once carefully enumerated in Latin, now circulated in the language of rumour, embroidered with details no clerk had recorded. What had been ecclesiastical evidence became tavern anecdote, and in the retelling, Alice gained powers far beyond those originally alleged. A noblewoman accused of heresy was already rare, one who vanished before judgment was irresistible. In some tellings, she had fled only to return by night, riding a black horse whose hooves made no sound on cobblestone. Seen from the corner of the eye, she would pass along High Street and vanish before reaching the marketplace. Merchants closing their shutters swore they had glimpsed the hem of a gown finer than any in the town since her departure. In others, she was said to wander the lanes on foot, her features unchanged by time, pausing to look into windows before melting into shadow. These accounts rarely agreed on details, but all agreed on the certainty of her presence. It was an odd immortality, visible enough to be feared, intangible enough to escape proof. Ballads began to appear in the markets, sung by itinerant minstrels whose knowledge of the trial was second-hand at best. They reduced her story to a sequence of set pieces, the masked feasts, the jars of powder, the whispered Latin, and ended with a refrain of her riding away under a moonless sky. These verses, traded for coins or cups of ale, preserved her notoriety in a form both portable and adaptable. The church's Latin register was bound to a shelf. The ballad could follow the road. It was, perhaps, the only medium in which her name travelled farther after her disappearance than before. Some versions recast her less as a criminal than as a wronged woman. In these, the bishop's court was the true villain, and her escape a victory over clerical arrogance. The details of bloodletting and demonic familiars were softened, replaced by hints of political persecution and family betrayal. This transformation was less about rehabilitation than about narrative convenience. A fugitive heroine could be placed in any number of settings, from convent gardens to foreign courts, without exhausting the audience's interest. As with all adaptable figures, her character reflected the needs of the teller more than the facts of the case. The ghost stories were less forgiving. In them, Alice was a cautionary presence, a spectral emblem of unchecked power and unrepented sin. One tale had her appear at the bedside of the sick, offering a cup of wine that, once drunk, ensured the patient would not see morning. Another claimed she could be heard laughing near street cornices on nights when the wind turned east, the sound carrying across the nave like a thread drawn tight. These accounts were not meant to be believed so much as felt, a way to give shape to unease in a town where the past was never entirely past. Kilkenny's merchants, who had once counted her as a customer, found commercial use for her notoriety. An inn claimed to serve wine from the cellars of the Lady Alice, though the cask had likely been rolled in from a Waterford quay. A cloth seller displayed a bolt of imported silk in the fashion she wore, though no one could quite agree on its colour. Such embellishments were part of the currency of trade. A legend could be stocked, displayed, and sold as readily as any other exotic import. In this way, her memory became part of the town's economy, as well as its folklore. The irony was that the historical Alice had lived in broad daylight, hosting feasts and conducting business in the open. It was only in legend that she acquired the habits of secrecy and nocturnal travel. Her documented life was that of a wealthy, visible figure. Her imagined afterlife, that of a shadow flitting between lamplight and alley. The transformation suited the purposes of both memory and morality, allowing her to be at once an object of fascination and a figure of warning. A woman who could appear anywhere was, in the medieval imagination, a woman who might appear to you. Even the bishop who had pursued her gained a place in these stories, though often as an unintended foil. In some versions, his sermons became the setting for her spectral appearances, as if she had returned to remind him of unfinished business. The fact that he outlived the trial by many years did nothing to diminish the symmetry. Folklore, like law, enjoys a sense of closure, even if it must invent it. Thus, the chase could continue long after both hunter and quarry were gone. By the 17th century, antiquarians collecting local tales found her story still active, though altered almost beyond recognition. She was now a composite of historical fact, imported witch lore, and local invention. Some accounts placed her in league with later continental witches. Others tied her to natural disasters or unexplained deaths in Kilkenny long after her time. What none could produce was a final resting place or a definitive end. She was, in this sense, more present in absence than she had ever been in life. The persistence of her legend says less about witchcraft than about the uses of a story. Alice Kyteler could serve as proof of moral decay, as a parable of cunning survival, or as a source of atmospheric entertainment on winter nights. She could be condemned, pitied, or admired without fear of contradiction. And each telling, whether sung in the market or whispered by a hearth, carried her further from the court records that had once fixed her in place. In leaving Kilkenny, she had stepped not only beyond the bishop's reach, but into the elastic space of collective memory, where judgment is always postponed. The case of Alice Kyteler did not open the floodgates to mass witch trials in Ireland. It remained an anomaly, a single, ornate prosecution whose ripples spread far but thin. In its immediate aftermath, there was no wholesale adoption of continental witch-hunting methods, no sudden string of burnings in market squares. Ireland, with its blend of Gaelic custom, Norman law, and ecclesiastical oversight, proved resistant to large-scale persecutions of the kind that would later grip Scotland, or the German principalities. Yet the trial left its mark in subtler ways, woven into both legal precedent and clerical ambition. Foremost among these was the precedent of framing witchcraft as heresy. Before 1324, the ecclesiastical courts in Ireland had not prosecuted sorcery on such terms. Magic, when addressed at all, was treated as superstition, sometimes sinful, but rarely elevated to the level of doctrinal crime. By placing Alice's alleged acts under the umbrella of heresy, Bishop Richard de Ledrede had established a pathway for future charges, one that bypassed the slower machinery of secular law. It meant that acts of supposed sorcery could now be tried in the bishop's court without first proving material harm in the king's court. This was a quiet but significant shift, and it remained available to any prelate willing to wield it. The trial also demonstrated how overlapping jurisdictions could be exploited. In Alice's case, the conflict between the bishop's authority and that of the secular officials in Kilkenny had slowed proceedings but had not stopped them. The eventual conviction of Petronilla de Meath showed that, with persistence, ecclesiastical law could prevail over local reluctance. In the years that followed, other bishops took note. Accusations of sorcery, especially when tangled with disputes over inheritance, land, or influence, could be pursued not merely as moral failings, but as threats to the faith. This framing lent spiritual urgency to what might otherwise have been seen as private quarrels. Yet, despite these legal openings, Ireland did not develop the sustained infrastructure of witch prosecution seen elsewhere. Part of this was cultural. Gaelic tradition acknowledged charms and curses, but it did not share the same demonological framework that underpinned continental witch hunts. Part was practical. The patchwork of laws and jurisdictions meant that each case required careful navigation, and few clerics had the will or resources to sustain lengthy campaigns. In a land where travel was slow and political boundaries porous, the idea of a coordinated, kingdom-wide purge was impractical at best. Alice's trial was grand theatre, but the stage was not easily rebuilt. The notoriety of the case did, however, linger in legal memory. Records of the proceedings circulated among church lawyers, cited in later disputes as examples of how heresy could encompass more than theological error. In some dioceses, these records were kept as a kind of instructional material, not as proof of the devil's presence, but as a model of procedural strategy. It was, in effect, a case study in how to secure a conviction when direct evidence was elusive. Future prosecutions for sorcery in Ireland, rare though they were, often echoed its structure. Ironically, the trial's influence was sometimes felt more abroad than at home. English clerics stationed in Ireland carried back reports of it, folding its details into sermons and polemics that warned of the devil's reach. In continental collections of witchcraft narratives, Alice occasionally appeared as an example of aristocratic depravity, a reminder that rank offered no immunity from spiritual corruption. Her story was thus absorbed into a broader European discourse on witchcraft, even as Ireland itself remained largely free from the mass hysteria those writings sometimes inspired. For Kilkenny, the case became part of its civic memory, occasionally resurfacing in local disputes over law and governance. When questions arose about the bishop's jurisdiction, the trial could be cited as proof that ecclesiastical authority had once reached into the affairs of even the wealthiest townspeople. The fact that the main accused had escaped did not diminish this claim. If anything, it lent the proceedings a sense of unfinished business, as if the court's reach had been proven in principle, if not in practice. It was a precedent more valuable for its symbolic weight than for its practical conclusion. By the late medieval period, the memory of Alice Kyteler in legal circles had grown abstract. She was less a person than a case file, a set of charges, a sequence of depositions, a final sentence carried out on a servant in her stead. In this form, she was useful. Stripped of the messy specifics of politics and personality, her trial could be invoked without reviving its controversies. It was a pattern the law often favoured, turning a living quarrel into a tidy precedent, ready for future use. The irony was that the trial's greatest legal achievement lay not in punishing the accused, but improving the adaptability of the system itself. A charge undefined in secular law had been fitted neatly into an existing ecclesiastical category. Overlapping jurisdictions had been navigated to produce a public execution, and the absence of the central figure had not prevented the case from serving its institutional purposes. It was, in its way, a victory of form over substance. For the bishop, that was enough. For the law, it was an example worth keeping. In the centuries that followed, Ireland would see occasional witchcraft trials, but none on the scale or spectacle of Kilkenny in 1324. When they did occur, they bore faint traces of Alice's case, the same blending of moral and political motives, the same reliance on testimony shaped by fear or advantage. The echoes were subtle, but they were there, reminders of a time when the machinery of church and law had converged to make a single woman the centre of a very public drama. The stage would not be built again in quite the same way, but its blueprint remained in the archives. And so, the legal ripples of the Kyteler trials spread outward, not as waves that reshaped the shore, but as rings on still water, fading slowly yet never quite disappearing. They left behind a lesson in the possibilities of jurisdictional creativity, and in the curious endurance of a precedent born from an absence. For all its theatre, the trial's most lasting legacy was quiet, a line in a bishop's register, a citation in a later dispute, and the reminder that, in the right hands, the law could be made to fit the story one wished to tell. In the winter imagination of medieval Europe, a witch was easy to picture. She was bent-backed, earthbound, crouched by a smoky hearth with a bundle of twigs for company. She belonged to the margins, a figure outside the walls, in the half-light between village and forest. Ireland's first recorded witch trial refused that image. Its accused was no ragged crone, but a jewel-draped widow whose home stood on the busiest street in Kilkenny. Her alleged crimes were committed not in a moss-roofed hut, but in candlelit chambers hung with imported cloth. The charges against her, demonic congress, poisonings, midnight rites, came filtered through a language borrowed from the continent. They were strange enough to be memorable, theatrical enough to be retold, and elastic enough to survive her absence. No one ever proved them to the satisfaction of all. No one ever disproved them entirely. In that ambiguity, Alice Kyteler's story found its durability. She became whatever the teller needed, a cautionary tale, a scandalous memory, or an emblem of cunning survival. The machinery that pursued her was equally memorable. 3 systems of law, secular, native, and ecclesiastical, converged for the occasion, each borrowing from the others to build a charge that had no firm place in any one of them. It was a piece of legal architecture designed for a single occupant, and once she stepped out of it, the structure stood empty. Yet the trial went on, the sentences were passed, and the fire was lit, proving, if nothing else, that a theatre can play to a full house even when its leading actor has left the stage. Her escape turned the case from a concluded prosecution into an unfinished narrative. Petronilla de Meth's execution gave it an ending. Alice's disappearance gave it a sequel. From that point forward, the 2 women's names were intertwined in a way the court had not intended, one as the first witch burned in Ireland, the other as the one who was never caught. The bishop had his precedent, the town had its scandal, and the story had its hook. In the centuries that followed, the written record narrowed, but the oral record expanded. Ballads softened her into a romantic exile. Ghost tales sharpened her into a malevolent presence. The truth, if it still existed, lay somewhere in the gap between parchment and song. Kilkenny learned to live with that gap. It became part of the town's character, a place where a trial could be remembered not for its verdict, but for its vanishing defendant. The irony is that Alice's most enduring magic was entirely mundane, knowing when to leave and where not to be. No jar of powder, no midnight invocation, no demon in canine form could have served her better than a timely departure. History records many elaborate prosecutions. It remembers fewer successful escapes. In this respect, her legacy was less about the devil's work than about the uses of absence. Today, her name survives in tourist lore, in scholarly footnotes, and in the occasional shiver of local pride. To some, she remains a scandal that never fully cooled. To others, a clever woman who outran the machinery built to catch her. The documents are still there for those who wish to read them, in Latin, with the formality of an accusation that expected a swift conclusion. They end without closure, the lines trailing off into procedural silence. It is tempting to imagine her final view of Kilkenny, the rooftops sinking behind her, the winter light dull on the river, the road ahead unspooling into uncertainty. Whether she laughed as she left is beyond proof, though the thought has pleased generations of tellers. It would fit the tone of a trial so rich in absurdity, a parting sound equal parts defiance and amusement. If there was such a laugh, it would have carried on the wind, briefly heard and then lost, much like Alice herself.